I, 19M, invested way too much into my first relationship with my ex, 18F, who cheated on me, and while I made so many mistakes and ruined it, I don't know how to move on. I, 19M, have a history of mental health challenges and traumatic experiences, and I encountered my now ex last summer during one of the most difficult periods of my life. We connected through a mutual friend and immediately clicked. It felt as though I had known her in countless previous lifetimes, and soon we began to communicate more. During our initial hangouts, we were accompanied by our mutual friend. However, on our second outing, we chose to spend time alone without her, which did not go over well with our mutual friend. We had to keep our friendship a secret at that time, relying on long-distance texts and video calls. As summer waned, we took the risk of sneaking out at night, and we shared 3 nights together in a purely platonic manner, simply enjoying one another's company. On the second night, I revealed my feelings for her, and she confessed she felt the same way. On the third night, I experienced my first kiss. At this point, I was already deeply emotionally attached. I would spend hours waiting for a text and would drop everything just to talk to her. I recognize how unhealthy this was, but at that moment, she was my sole source of happiness. Following that third night, I had to relocate to a different city about 2 hours away for university, yet we made it a point to stay connected throughout the day via texts and video calls. With each moment spent together, my attachment intensified, resulting in an unbearable clinginess that ultimately drove her away. My ex had a highly troubled past. It seemed like everyone was against her. Her parents treated her terribly, her previous partners were abusive, and she was living alone after being kicked out. Although she was bright, her educational commitments suffered due to trauma and fear occupying her mind. I found myself drawn to her because I admired the resilience she displayed while facing her challenges alone. I knew a relationship with her would be difficult. My friends warned me that it was unwise to commit given my circumstances and her history, fearing it would only end in pain for both of us. Yet, I couldn't help but grow more attached. The month that followed our mutual confession of feelings was the highest point of my life. My struggles with depression, anxiety, paranoia, and family issues seemed to vanish with every moment spent with her. I became so addicted to this feeling that I craved her presence to the extent that I wanted all her time dedicated to me. She initially dedicated a lot of her day to me, but I understood it wouldn't hold indefinitely. As she started to pull away, it felt as if I were losing her. During this month, she repeatedly communicated that she was not ready for a relationship, stating that she was in a phase of exploring to move on from her ex, advising that we should take things slow. I pleaded with her to at least agree to be exclusive, unaware that I was one of 3 other guys she was leading on. She justified her hesitance to commit by expressing concern over potentially hurting me, a sentiment she often reiterated throughout our time together. We kept our interactions hidden from our mutual friend, who played an incredibly significant role in both our lives. This mutual friend had supported my ex through the challenges of living alone and had helped me manage my mental health struggles for years. Eventually, I confided in our mutual friend about my feelings for my ex, thinking she would take it well, but I sensed her resentment beneath the surface. A couple of weeks afterward, my ex and I officially became a couple and went on our first date. I made it a point to return to my hometown every 2 to 3 weeks, ensuring that I devoted the entire weekend to her. This created significant tension with my family and friends, as each return involved neglecting my parents, further complicating our already strained relationship. As October arrived, we found more opportunities to see each other. Just before we started dating, she moved back in with her parents, but we still made an effort to connect. However, my clinginess worsened, distancing her even more. The affection, excitement, and affectionate messages diminished until reaching a breaking point in November when she ghosted me. I had been grappling with self-harm, and the situation exacerbated those feelings. Just before she ghosted me, we had a discussion about her abusive ex who stalked her, and in a misguided attempt at humor, I mentioned committing Sudoku if she left me. I have no excuse for that, especially given her background. On the day she cut off contact, I engaged in self-harm again, feeling obligated to share it with her. In retrospect, I realize how manipulative that was, and I should have kept it to myself. She ghosted me for a week while I inundated her phone with calls and messages imploring for a response. By this stage of our relationship, my contact had already been obsessive, but it escalated as I felt increasingly abandoned. One night, she called, telling me that although she wasn't breaking up with me, our mutual friend had given her an ultimatum. If she did not end our relationship, our mutual friend would do it for her. We agreed to distance ourselves from this friend, which slowly began to heal some wounds. I attempted to become less clingy and intrusive, but by that point, the damage was extensive. She spoke to me as if she were in a corporate setting and recently admitted she had kissed another man on Halloween before our breakup. She shared vague details about this incident, mentioning how she celebrated Halloween for the first time with our mutual friend, how one of her friend's boyfriend's friends flirted with her, and how she allowed him to put handcuffs on her. She claimed she didn't realize he was flirting. However, she later confessed they had kissed. I exerted even more effort into our relationship in hopes of mending the apparent rift, whether it was through words of affirmation, gifts, time, or effort, all while trying to maintain healthy boundaries. In the following months, we would spend time on video calls while I was at university, which became a regular occurrence for me. Although I provided her space throughout the day, I expected at least one brief conversation daily, whether it was a simple, "How are you?" or her checking in on me. I sincerely apologized and accepted responsibility for my mistakes, believing I had made visible changes. She told me she had forgiven me and that, despite her commitment to ending the relationship, a part of her couldn't let go. She needed a break to comprehend why. However, she could never explain why she remained with me, so I stopped asking. From that point, we continued our relationship, albeit feeling slightly off. In person, everything felt the same, yet over distance, she began to act cooler and more distant. Initially, I attributed this to the recent break and the lingering awkwardness that followed. Before our relationship began, we promised to communicate openly and renewed that pledge after our separation. I made every effort to check in on her, asking if I could do anything to improve our dynamic or if any of my actions continued to push her away, but she never provided any feedback. When winter break rolled around, we spent nearly every day together, and I believed things had returned to normal. However, when I returned to university, she became even colder than before, and it was challenging to engage her in conversation. By late January, I was the sole one invested in the relationship, while she had started seeing someone new. During this span, our mutual friend was attempting to set her up with various individuals, including the man she initially cheated on me with on Halloween, discussing a potential threesome involving her and her boyfriend, and most recently, this new acquaintance. I only discovered she had cheated on me once, but sensed something was off when she spoke about this new individual. For the sake of anonymity, I will refer to him as Chamberlain. He was a powerlifter who identified as bisexual. I expressed my discomfort regarding him, sharing my uneasy instincts, but she dismissed my feelings, even going on a tirade against LGBTQ individuals. My ex was a devout Christian who considered homosexuality a sin, using that belief to justify why she would never betray me with him. This was early February, and I had just proposed that she be my Valentine in an elaborate manner. She agreed, and a week later, she gave me my gift, a hoodie. Ironically, by the time of this conversation, she had already developed feelings for him, and in the weeks that followed, she would text and flirt with him behind my back. She concocted a tale about being forced by her parents to volunteer at a church since she had lost her job in early January. I tracked her location and frequently noticed she was at a house. This contradicted her church narrative, raising my suspicions, but I kept them to myself. She claimed she would be unavailable the next day due to volunteering, yet she would go entire days without contacting me, which I recognized was deliberate, given that her daily routine involved chores and extensive time on her phone, watching TikToks and playing games. Deep down, I suspected she was unfaithful, but I convinced myself she must have had some other explanation. One day, during a phone conversation while she was on her way to volunteer, she casually asked how I would react if she cheated. I replied that I honestly didn't know how I would respond, but that I probably would see it coming. Although it caught me completely off guard, I had an inkling it was an ominous sign. Around the same time, she confided that her first ex had contacted her, admitting that she had cheated on him after he had initially betrayed her. I was already aware she had been unfaithful to her second ex by going out on a date while involved with him, but she claimed that it happened after discovering he had cheated first. This revelation of her past infidelities unsettled me. I was straightforward with her about my feelings but decided to overlook it. The signs were unmistakable, yet I vowed not to judge her for her past. On February 11th, she surprised me at university, yet she appeared completely disengaged. She avoided making eye contact with me and did not reciprocate any attempts at intimacy. She was experiencing a rough time, stating that on Valentine's Day, we were going to share a cigarette together. By the 12th of February, she had already been to that house multiple times, coinciding with my psychiatric appointment. Mental health care in my area is notoriously difficult to access, and I had started making strides toward getting help in November, using the break in our relationship as an incentive to improve before risking losing her. I had been on several medications since then and participated in some therapy sessions, but the earliest psychiatric appointment I secured was in February. I informed her that I'd call after 12 p.m. to share how it went. However, by the time my appointment concluded, she was already at that house. She understood the significance of this appointment to me, yet chose to ghost me that day. The next day, February 13th, she continued to ignore me, and I tracked her at the same house again. While she ghosted me and was unfaithful, I dedicated 6 hours to handwriting a love letter for her as a gift. On Valentine's Day, she completely ghosted me as well, with her location tracking showing her at the mall and then at that house again. I had returned to my hometown for reading week that same day, and she continued to avoid me, providing vague replies after having ghosted me outright. I sent her lengthy messages expressing how I felt disposable, replaced, and unloved, only to receive silence and insincere apologies in return. I even ordered Taco Bell for her through a food delivery service, believing I had been too harsh, despite knowing she had been unfaithful. I discovered her lies when I found the address she was frequently visiting, which linked to a yoga studio owned by Chamberlain's mother and confirmed their relationship on social media. However, this past Monday night, she confessed to cheating on me, shattering my world. We planned to meet the following day, during which I spent 5 hours pouring out my feelings while she sat in silence. I requested to see her phone, but she refused. I asked her to block him, and she declined. When I inquired if she had feelings for him, she remained initially silent but ultimately admitted it. She revealed she lost nearly all feelings for me when she first ghosted me. I don't understand why she stayed. She couldn't provide a rationale for misleading me. We never discussed how her ghosting impacted me, as she denied me any opportunity to express myself, insisting we had already addressed that in a previous conversation where I was apologizing for my errors. Eventually, I persuaded her to show me their texts, which devastated me further. There was no sexual content. She had not engaged in sexual relations with him. Instead, she conveyed how they watched movies together, that she met his parents, kissed, and cuddled. Her messages were filled with innocent flirtations, expressing eagerness to see him again and a desire to play video games together. Throughout our relationship, she consistently dismissed the notion of my meeting her parents. On the day of my psychiatric appointment, I sent her a good morning text at 7:25 a.m., which I later discovered was followed by her texting him good morning at 7:27 a.m. I received a reply an hour later. She messaged him in the same affectionate manner she had used with me in September, solidifying my knowledge that I had lost her. He was more of a partner to her in just 2 weeks than I had been in 4 months. When I asked if she felt guilty about cheating, she said yes. When I inquired whether she regretted her actions, she indicated that part of her did. I asked if she loved me, and she mentioned that a small part of her did. She confessed that she never envisioned a future with me, honestly stating that I was merely temporary. While she claimed a small part of her cared for me, it was in a manner that did not equate to love. During our conversation, she conveyed that she needed space from all men, including Chamberlain and myself. She expressed a need to sort through her issues, emphasizing that she did not require a break from our relationship, but rather a break from relationships altogether, effectively meaning she was ending our partnership. I pleaded with her to reconsider, asking what I could improve or why she failed to communicate with me, but it was all in vain. Eventually, we mutually agreed to part ways, but I issued her an ultimatum. Either she would inform Chamberlain of her cheating by midnight, or I would. Ultimately, I lack evidence to ascertain whether she informed him, and while I am tempted to contact him for confirmation, I find myself disinclined. After breaking up, we spoke and established the terms of our separation, seemingly parting on good terms. We agreed to maintain separate friend groups, limit contact, but remain unblocked in case we wanted to message each other or share posts. I asked her if there was a possibility of reconciling in the future, and she responded, "Maybe," but suggested we were likely done forever. We chose to continue snapping one another to preserve our snap streak, and while she remains my closest friend, a part of me craves to block her across all platforms. The past few days have felt like a hazy blur. I have experienced panic attacks, uncontrollable crying spells, and an inability to leave my bed. The emotional turmoil manifests physically. I feel akin to a burn victim, and each thought of her only deepens the pain. My mind already grapples with intrusive thoughts, and whenever she appears in my thoughts, I spiral further. I feel hollow inside, and the anguish courses beneath my skin. I haven't eaten in 4 days, nor am I able to sleep as my mind races with thoughts of her. I've resorted to drinking to fall asleep and vaping throughout the day. Although my anger has mostly subsided, and despite having plenty of information that could lead to revenge, I see it as futile. A part of me remains hopeful for a future, even though I recognize how unhealthy everything was. I made a plethora of mistakes during our time together, which ultimately pushed her away last November, leading me to live a facade since then, but I believed I had worked diligently enough to restore our bond. Not a single day has gone by without my efforts to better myself. Although that does not erase the harm I caused, it gave me hope for a change in our relationship's trajectory. For months, I have shouldered blame for everything, convinced that every outcome was my fault, and I carried that guilt with me through our relationship. Despite it gnawing at me, I never revealed it to her. I sought simple reassurances, yet all I received were empty responses, perpetuating an already challenging cycle. I remain uncertain regarding the path ahead. I know I messed it up. I recognize I was a poor partner, and that the consequences stemmed from my actions months prior. I acknowledge I became overly dependent on her for my happiness, understanding that putting all my emotional investments into one individual was perilous. While I realize I require therapy and professional support, the associated financial strain and time constraints render it infeasible in the short term. With upcoming exams looming, I am not in the right state of mind to commit myself to studying. I understand I should utilize this experience as motivation for self-improvement, but right now, all I wish to do is curl up and sleep indefinitely. I yearn to comprehend why she led me on for such an extended period, why she agreed to be my Valentine when she had already committed to Chamberlain, why she continued making plans with me knowing she had no intention of following through, and why she maintained the illusion that I mattered to her, that she cared for me, and that she would never cause me pain. I pleaded with her not to betray me, assuring her that if she found someone else, she should leave me first. I tolerated considerable disrespect, believing I deserved it, or feeling I had to make concessions out of fear of appearing controlling. I will figure things out over time, but I needed to unburden myself. Story 2. Aita for wanting to get paid. I am currently employed at my family's business, handling the paperwork and accounting. I began my role on June 24. Initially, I received a salary of $900 per week, which I found quite satisfactory, and I was genuinely appreciative of it. During that period, I did not ask for much, but I remained thankful nonetheless. To provide some background, I possess no prior accounting experience. I never expressed a desire to work in the family business because I was hesitant about mixing business with family, yet my father insisted that I take the position. Fast forward a month or two, I began to make errors with my work and cash management. Consequently, my parents reduced my pay to $600 per week. I accepted this change because I acknowledged my mistakes, and it served as motivation for me to correct them, which I ultimately did. I work 6 days a week. I have the advantage of working from home and put in full shifts from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. I remained silent about my pay for approximately 4 months, but the notion of not receiving adequate compensation began to surface in my mind. During this time, part of me felt guilty, calling myself greedy for considering that my pay was insufficient, reminding myself to be grateful for what I had. However, another part of me believed it was unjust to receive only 100 per day for 8 hours of work. I allowed the thoughts of greed to silence me, brushing it aside and continuing to accept my current wage. It is worth mentioning that I received training on the accounting software, but that is where the training stopped. I had to be reprimanded to learn about areas in which I lacked understanding. Eventually, my aunt, who had taught me the fundamentals of accounting, called to inquire about my job satisfaction. I replied that it was okay, and as the conversation progressed, I opened up to her about everything. I manage customer relations in addition to handling supplier invoices. She validated my feelings and mentioned that I was not being fairly compensated. This is my father's older sister, by the way. I vented to her about having to also care for my baby brother, including dropping him off at school and putting him to bed while working. My aunt offered to speak with my father on my behalf before hanging up. I could have directly approached my parents about a pay adjustment, but I anticipated being reprimanded and labeled ungrateful, so my aunt's validation brought me some relief. A few hours later, my father arrived home and appeared very angry. My mother came in and reprimanded me for involving my aunt in the matter, asserting that my aunt wouldn't stand by me in the same way they do and called me selfish for seeking better pay. Additionally, I should note that in my previous job, I earned between 600 and 800 per week for 4 days of work. I left that position due to a toxic work environment that negatively impacted my mental well-being. My parents made me feel ungrateful and greedy for wanting to renegotiate my pay, comparing my current work to my former job and claiming I was doing less now, which is not accurate. If anything, it felt like I was contributing more because it was a family business. My older sister, who does not live with us, also criticized me. She resides in an apartment that my parents bought for her and commented that my parents are not rich, labeling me as selfish. My father scolded me and kicked me out of the house, so I temporarily stayed at my grandparents' home. I understand that involving my aunt was not the best decision, but I believed she could give me an honest assessment due to her experience in the same field. My parents never inquired about my work or if it was challenging. They only scolded me for my mistakes. In contrast, my aunt consistently checked in on me weekly, offering to assist me in her spare time and even traveled 40 minutes to help me grasp concepts better. While at my grandparents' house, I refrained from doing any work initially. Eventually, after 3 days, I completed the tasks because no one else was available, and I felt guilty. Shortly thereafter, my aunt informed me that my parents wanted me to return home. Honestly, I believe they didn't genuinely want me back. They just needed my assistance with my baby brother. Upon returning home, my parents stated that I would not be compensated for my work, and if I required money for outings, I could simply ask. I felt disheartened for a moment but realized I had brought this situation upon myself. Fast forward 6 months, and I find myself without any income but still working 6 days a week. Each time I go out, which occurs a maximum of twice a week, I ask my parents for money. I receive around 100 on each outing, occasionally 200 on a good day. I do my best to make that money last as long as possible so I don't have to request it again. Although I continue performing the same tasks, I am beginning to lose motivation, as there is nothing to anticipate in this line of work. Regardless, I strive to push through and give it my all. I dislike being financially dependent on my parents and the necessity of asking for money each time I go out. A few weeks ago, I approached my mother about resuming my salary for my full-time job. She informed me that she could do that. A week later, I asked again, and she replied affirmatively. Another week passed, and I inquired once more, only for her to suggest I speak with my father. As time went on, this past week, I again asked if I could receive payment, or if she could discuss it with my father, explaining that I wanted to save for my upcoming trip with my boyfriend and other approaching events, like Christmas and birthdays, instead of always asking for money. My sister proposed that I refrain from asking my parents for money for a few weeks, then request a larger sum right before my trip. My mother agreed that it was a reasonable plan. I mentioned that I would ask for around 3,000. My sister advised against requesting so much before my trip, suggesting I conserve my requests for a few weeks. Eventually, some time passed, and my sister was off the phone with my mother, leaving just her and me on the line. $3,000 for your trip is excessive, she remarked. I countered that it was either I received a proper salary and could save for my trip without judgment, or I would have to request however much I needed right before I left. She remarked on something, which I don't recall, but I felt hurt and chose to remain quiet. Eventually, I shared that I was offended she implied I ask for too much. It's essential to understand that I try to limit my requests because I recognize how hard my parents work for their money. She responded by claiming that my sisters and I simply dig for their money without offering any repayment. She also accused me of spending money frivolously. However, I only spend what she provides on essentials like food, gym costs, and groceries. I told her that I essentially have no income and queried what she expected me to do. She then claimed that we never offer to pay for meals when we go out, to which I argued that I cannot offer anything since I do not have money. She fell silent. The conversation escalated, and I became frustrated and upset, as the message she was conveying suggested I demanded too much money from her, which I knew to be untrue. My monthly expenditures are lower than both of my sisters. She complained that she had to cover my nail and toe expenses, but the reality was that when I had a stable income, I could afford those luxuries myself. After our argument, I left the room, leaving me uncertain about whether I am in the wrong for wanting to be compensated fairly. Story 3. Got my freshman dorm leader fired a year after he called the cops on me. I have never really shared anything before, but I have a humorous story about revenge and karma that my friends have always found entertaining. I began my college journey during my freshman year and met the dorm leader, known as the resident assistant in many institutions. Similar to most colleges, the dorm leader was an upperclassman who resided in the dorms and oversaw the freshman halls. My dorm leader was named Julio, a pseudonym, and initially appeared to be a friendly guy who kept to himself. He mentioned that he would stay out of everyone's affairs if we did the same with his. He also attempted to portray himself as the cool dorm leader and often relayed stories of how he consumed a lot of alcohol during his own freshman year in the dorms. He conveyed that he was indifferent about whether we drank in our dorm rooms as long as we kept it discreet. While I typically did not drink much, I appreciated that he seemed quite normal and refrained from reporting students. In the final week of October of my freshman year, I faced one of the most challenging weeks of my academic journey. I was a biochemistry major struggling with some demanding courses and had 3 exams scheduled that week. At the week's conclusion, a friend who lived down the hall invited me to his dorm to watch an upcoming NBA game. While we were immersed in the game, he produced a bottle of vodka and shared some with the others in the dorm. Being an unsuspecting and naive freshman eager to socialize, I took 1 shot of vodka and continued enjoying the game. During the game, one of the guys in the dorm accidentally spilled a soda and dashed to the bathroom to fetch some paper towels. As he exited the dorm room, Julio happened to pass by and spotted the vodka. He chuckled and remarked something along the lines of, "I remember my freshman year, haha, just try to keep it down." We expressed our gratitude and wished him a good night. It felt like a typical exchange without any unusual undertones. 30 minutes later, we heard a knock on the door, and 2 police officers arrived with breathalyzers in hand. They informed us that they had received a complaint from Julio regarding underage drinking and a party being held in the dorm room. Keep in mind, there were only 3 of us watching a Lakers game on a Thursday night at 8 p.m. Consequently, I ended up with a minor in consumption charge for registering a .02, which entailed 20 hours of community service, a reflection journal, and a meeting with the Judicial Affairs Office concerning my supposed drinking issue. I do not hold the officer accountable for issuing the ticket. However, I was quite upset that Julio, who frequently spoke of partying hard during his freshman year, chose to call the authorities right after he essentially gave us his approval for the evening. A few weeks later, I confronted Julio directly and inquired why he felt the need to inform on me. Specifically, I asked why he did not simply tell me to return to my dorm if he had an issue with the alcohol, instead of calling the police immediately after our interaction. He replied verbatim, "You made a decision and had to face the consequences of that decision." Following that incident, I ceased communication with him, although he always attempted to act overly friendly whenever he saw me in the hallway. Eventually, I moved off campus for my sophomore year, as I had opted to join a fraternity during my freshman year and encountered some wonderful individuals. While I have never been one for fraternities, I attended a smaller college where the fraternity culture diverges significantly from that of larger institutions. During the second semester of my sophomore year, my fraternity was accepting a new pledge class. One day, I received a text from Julio stating, "One of the pledges in your fraternity has been caught supplying alcohol to another freshman in the dorms. I thought I would inform you." It turned out that Julio was the dorm leader for a freshman pledging my fraternity and had reported him to judicial affairs as well. Finding the term supplying alcohol to be absurdly funny, I shared this in our fraternity group me, which led to a great deal of laughter. About a week later, that kid who was pledging our fraternity approached me about the message I received from Julio. Essentially, something very similar had occurred to him as what had happened to me. Julio discovered he had given another resident in the dorm a bottle of wine and reported this to the authorities. This individual ended up with a minor in possession charge and was required to meet with judicial affairs. This is where the story gets quite amusing. During his meeting with judicial affairs, the pledge informed the official that his dorm leader, Julio was already a senior by this point, had texted me about the charges he was facing. Evidently, discussing pending charges against a freshman with a third party is a significant violation. The judicial affairs representative told him that if he could demonstrate that Julio had disclosed this charge to a third party, meaning me, he would face severe repercussions. Essentially, if I sent that text to judicial affairs, Julio would find himself in a great deal of trouble. So I forwarded the text to the judicial affairs office that very night. Afterward, I did not hear anything regarding Julio's fate and had honestly forgotten about it. However, as the school year was drawing to a close during my sophomore year, I encountered Julio in the dining hall. He approached me and recounted a tale of how he realized I was the one who informed on him to judicial affairs, how he had been dismissed from his position as dorm leader, lost the scholarship funding tied to his role, and overall how miserable his life had become since his termination. After he completed his sob story, he questioned me. "Why did you do that?" This could have been handled in an entirely different manner. I didn't have to lose my job, and I could have retained my scholarship money. I gazed at him intently for what felt like 30 seconds and replied, "Julio, you made a decision and had to suffer the consequences of that decision." In summary, my resident assistant made it seem acceptable for us to drink in the dorms, yet subsequently reported us to the police. I later used the same one-liner on him a year later when I got him fired for breaching school policy.